up the show here, an expert witness on state capture testifying before the Commission about the phenomena that has been, of course, gripping the country and has been the focus of the state capture inquiry. Anti-corruption expert Daniel Kaufmann says state capture can come in many forms in transitional economies. But how does it vary from country to country? Well, let's get him on the line. He joins me now from our Cape Town studios. Daniel, good evening. You've been studying the phenomena of state capture, perhaps from a more global perspective, and perhaps to put what we're experiencing in South Africa into context. What does the global picture of state capture within emerging economies especially look like?
Yes, good evening, Kathy, and the audience. Thank you for the opportunity. Let me start by indicating that indeed, if your experts and the citizens and the leaders of the country have determined that in South Africa there is and there has been a challenge of state capture for some time, you are certainly not alone. And that's where my expertise, together with some colleagues, particularly Professor Hellman, we developed the notion of state capture, having observed what happened when the Soviet Union fell. The Iron Curtain falls, and the new countries that begin to emerge with institutions which are totally in flux. So we developed this notion, and we saw the particular vulnerabilities of countries in transition after there is a major change, because many of the institutions then are very fragile, they're very fluid, and they're subject to capture. And we observe that definitely in countries like Russia, Ukraine, many in Central Asia, and others, as opposed to some countries that then became part of the new Europe in Central and Eastern Europe. So not every country was subject to that. But it has been a phenomenon which is particularly relevant in countries in transition. Let me also add that, and obviously South Africa then would not be alone in that context, but it's not only about emerging economies, and it's not about developing countries. Sophisticated countries in Latin America have been subject to that, but also in the very rich industrialized world. The United States, at different points in time, have been subject to that, and right now there are these risks and vulnerabilities associated with state capture, which are ongoing in that country as well. There are risks also. A country in transition, which is very rich and industrialized, is obviously Britain, because of Brexit. So these risks and vulnerabilities exist also in the very rich industrialized world.
Let's talk about the role of the private sector, because you've pointed it out as playing a significant role, particularly in shaping the rules under which then state capture is allowed to take place, at least systematically.
That's absolutely right, Kathy. And the very big distinction we made from the traditional approach to corruption in the past, which was basically focused on what we call administrative corruption, which is essentially the corruption that happens in administering or implementing the rules and regulations and the laws that exist. If I need to get around red tape, and pay a little bit of a bribe here and there for that, or a bigger bribe, or for a driver's license, and so on. That was the focus, and that was subject to measure. We observed that there was a much more significant and costly for all of society a type of corruption, which, as you said, it was not in implementing the rules that would happen. It would happen in the form of very powerful private elites that would shape for their own benefit at the expense of the whole nation, would shape the laws, the regulations, the policy, the whole procurement system, the public expenditure and public finance system for their own benefit at the expense of all the citizens. That comes obviously in different forms. We talked at first about who is the captor, so who does the capture, and that's typically in the private sector, and not only the so-called legal private sector, very powerful individuals or the industrial financial complex or the military industrial complex in some countries, but also in some countries it is the mafia. It's related also to drug money and so on. So who is the captor varies from country to country.
And
on the other extreme, it's the one who is captured.
Sorry to interject there. In terms of the sectors, because you've listed quite a variety of players that could influence how state capture takes place. But in terms of the trends, is there sectors that are most likely to be targets from the figures and the data you've been working with, or does it affect every industry?
Yeah, very good question again. So it varies from country to country. First, who is the captor, but then who are the captured? Which types of organizations are the target? Which type of sectors will depend, obviously, on their own vulnerabilities, but also, very importantly, of where the rents, where the money is. Is the old joke of why do so many robbers are interested in robbing a bank? It's because that's where the money is. So the financial sector, obviously, is very vulnerable. But in other countries, in many countries, financial sector is not very well developed, and it's not that much rents to be had. And then a more important side of the capture happens in natural resources, in extractives, particularly in oil, sometimes in mining. In other places, it's also the infrastructure and construction area. So it will vary depending on where the major rents are. But it's very important nowadays to recognize that there are differences in that context.
All right. Before I let you go, just the last question. Often it's the bureaucrats and organizations that are struggling with the pushback, whether it's taking instruction from their ministers or the heads of state at the time. So from an institutional perspective, how do we strengthen mechanisms and frameworks that I suppose gives these bureaucrats more power to actually stand up when they do see that there are problems in the system? Very briefly, please.
Very briefly. First, there has to be more scrutiny and meritocracy in general in the appointment of the highest official for the land, and vetting in terms of integrity and also quality. And that applies at all levels. Second, whistleblower protection is really important. Third, there can be no impunity, so that the one that is doing the pressuring knows that is at serious risk, if this comes out, of ending up with a very significant sanction, whatever that is. So rule of law has to work. And last but not least, the role of additional transparency measures so that everything becomes more transparent. The contracts for procurement, the appointments to have a high office, the disclosure in terms of their assets and incomes of politicians and public servants. That helps a lot, helps civil society and the leaders of civil society, NGOs, think tanks, academics, to use these, to use the data and make their civil service, but also their politicians, even more importantly, accountable. And that has been the experience of my own country in Chile, where we made significant progress on these issues, which we also had a commission there, and much of it has been implemented, not only in terms of rule of law issues, but all kinds of other reforms. Yeah. State-owned enterprise reform is incredibly important in that context too.
Well, it certainly sounds like there are many lessons that South Africa can learn from other countries. Let me thank you for your time tonight. Anti-corruption expert Daniel Kaufmann.